Every woman who went to the Silent Mountain Man's cabin came back before sunrise. Some refused to explain why. Others said the same thing. There is something wrong with that man. For years, the people in the remote mountain settlement whispered that Silas Vale was cursed. He lived alone beyond the northern ridge, spoke almost nothing, and never allowed anyone to get close. Then, one winter morning in 1878, a beautiful woman arrived in town, carrying an old silver compass. She asked only one question: "Where can I find Silas Vale?" The townspeople tried to warn her. They told her every bride who had ever been sent to that mountain had run away. But the woman didn't care, because she wasn't going to the mountain to become his bride. She had spent 20 years searching for him. When she was only 6 years old, Silas had carried her through a deadly blizzard after her parents died. She had never forgotten his face, she had never forgotten his voice, and she had never forgotten the promise he made while carrying her through the snow. "Keep your eyes open, we're going home." Now, 20 years later, she had finally found him. But there was one thing she didn't know. Silas believed the little girl he saved that night had died long ago. And when he saw her standing outside his cabin, holding the compass he had lost 20 years earlier, the Silent Mountain Man finally spoke. What he told her would uncover a secret buried beneath the mountain for 2 decades, and change both of their lives forever. Before we enter the mountains, if you enjoy emotional historical romance stories with mystery, survival, and unexpected twists, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue creating these long-form stories for you. Let's go back to the winter of 1878. The winter when everyone believed the Silent Mountain Man was cursed, and the woman who had spent half her life looking for him finally came home. What if the most feared man in the mountains was not a monster at all, but the boy who had once carried a dying little girl through a blizzard because he could not bear to leave her behind? And what if, 20 years later, that little girl came back to find him? In the winter of 1878, there was a settlement so remote that travelers could ride for days without seeing another house. It sat between dark pine forests and mountains that remained white long after spring arrived in the valleys below. The settlement had no proper road, no telegraph station, and no doctor. People lived by hunting, trapping, logging, and whatever food they could grow during the short summer. The people there had learned to respect silence, but they feared one particular kind of silence: the silence of a man named Silas Vale. Silas lived alone beyond the northern ridge, nearly 6 miles from the settlement. His cabin stood beside a frozen creek, surrounded by pine trees so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. He rarely came into town. When he did, he bought flour, salt, lamp oil, coffee, and ammunition, then left without saying more than a few words. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders from years of chopping wood and hauling traps. His dark hair was usually hidden beneath an old wool hat, and a scar ran from his left eyebrow toward his cheek. But it was not his size or his scar that frightened people. It was his silence. Silas had not spoken a full sentence in years. Some said he had lost his voice in an accident. Others said he had gone mad after his family died. A few claimed he had killed a man and taken an oath never to speak again. Nobody knew the truth. The truth was simpler and sadder. Silas had learned very young that words could not bring back the dead. When Silas was 24, an avalanche had destroyed the small mining camp where his younger brother worked. Silas had searched the wreckage for 3 days. He found his brother beneath the snow. After that, something inside him changed. He stopped talking. He moved farther into the mountains, and eventually the people of the settlement began telling stories about him. The strangest part was what happened whenever a woman was sent to marry him. Silas had never asked for a bride, but over the years, several families had considered him a suitable husband for daughters who had little money or few prospects. The first woman lasted 3 days. The second lasted 1 night. The third never even reached his cabin. Each return to the settlement with the same frightened description. He never speaks. He watches everything. There is something wrong with that man. Soon, people started saying that every woman who went to Silas Vale ran away. The story grew until it became a local legend. Then, in the spring of 1878, a woman named Clara Whitmore arrived in town. She was 26 years old. She traveled alone. She wore a brown traveling coat, carried a worn leather case, and had the calm expression of someone who had already made a decision she would not reverse. The people at the small general store watched her carefully. She asked only one question: "Where does Silas Vale live?" The storekeeper stopped counting coins. An old hunter sitting near the stove looked up. Someone laughed nervously. "You don't want Silas Vale." Clara looked at him. "I didn't ask whether I wanted him." The room became quiet. "I asked where he lives." Nobody answered immediately. Finally, the storekeeper pointed toward the northern ridge. "Follow the creek until it disappears beneath the pines. You'll see a cabin with a red door." Clara nodded. She thanked him and walked outside. But before she left, the storekeeper called after her. "Miss Whitmore." She turned. "You're not the first woman to go looking for that man." Clara's expression softened. "No," she said, "but I may be the first one who knows who he really is." The storekeeper stared at her. Clara walked away. She had not come to the mountains for marriage. She had come because she had spent 20 years searching for a memory. When Clara was 6 years old, she had become lost during a winter journey with her parents. Her father had been transporting supplies between two settlements when a sudden snowstorm swallowed the trail. The wagon overturned. Her mother died before morning. Her father disappeared. Clara remembered almost nothing after that. Only snow, cold, a terrible wind, and a young man carrying her through the forest. She remembered his coat. She remembered the smell of pine smoke. She remembered his hands wrapped around hers so they would not freeze. Most of all, she remembered his voice. He had told her, "Keep your eyes open. We're going home." Then, everything went dark. Clara had survived. She was found 2 days later near a trading post. The young man who saved her had vanished before anyone could learn his name. For years, Clara searched for him. She remembered only fragments: a dark coat, a scar near his eyebrow, a small silver compass hanging around his neck, and one unusual thing: the man who carried her had been completely calm while the entire mountain seemed to be dying around them. As Clara grew older, the memory became more important to her. She eventually discovered that the man had been a young hunter from the northern mountains. His name, she learned, was Silas Vale. That was why she had come. Not to become his bride, not to rescue him. She had come to say thank you, and perhaps to find out why the man who had once saved her had disappeared from the world. As Clara climbed toward his cabin, she did not know that Silas was already watching her. From the trees above the trail, the silent mountain man saw the woman approaching. He recognized her before she ever reached the cabin. Not because he remembered her face, because he remembered the small scar beneath her chin. He had placed that scar there himself. 20 years earlier, while carrying a freezing 6-year-old girl through a blizzard, he had wrapped his scarf around her neck. She had been bleeding from the small cut. Silas had never forgotten that face. He had simply believed she was dead. Now she was standing outside his cabin, and for the first time in years, Silas Vale was afraid. Not of the woman, of what her return might force him to remember. Subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more stories like this one. Now let's return to the mountain. Clara knocked. No answer. She knocked again. The door opened. Silas stood there. He looked older than the man she remembered, but the scar was still there. Clara stared at him. Silas stared back. Neither spoke. Then Clara slowly reached into her coat. She pulled out a small silver compass. Silas's face changed. For the first time in 20 years, the silent mountain man looked completely shaken. Because it was his compass. The same compass he had carried the night he saved her. And Clara had kept it all those years. She held it toward him. "You left this beside me," she whispered. Silas looked at the compass, then at her. His lips moved, but no words came. Clara smiled through tears. "I found you." And somewhere deep inside the mountain, a secret that had been buried for 20 years was about to come back to life. Clara stayed at Silas Vale's cabin that night, not because she trusted him completely, not because she had forgotten the stories. She stayed because the sky had turned dark, the temperature had dropped, and the trail back to town had disappeared beneath a fresh layer of snow. Silas gave her the small bedroom. He slept beside the stove. That first night, neither of them slept much. Clara lay beneath a heavy wool blanket, staring at the ceiling. She had imagined meeting Silas countless times. Sometimes she imagined finding a kind old man. Sometimes she imagined a broken man who had forgotten the past. Sometimes she imagined that the boy who saved her had never existed outside her childhood memory. She had never imagined this, a silent, scarred mountain man sitting beside a fire with his back toward her door. At midnight, Clara heard footsteps. She opened her eyes. Silas was walking outside. She followed. He stood beneath the trees, looking toward the mountains. Moonlight covered the snow. Clara stopped several feet behind him. "You remembered me," she said. Silas did not turn. "Yes," he finally whispered. His voice was rough. Clara froze. It was the first time she had heard him speak. "You can talk." Silas looked over his shoulder. "I can." "Then why don't you?" He looked toward the valley. "Because there wasn't much worth saying." Clara stepped closer. "You saved my life." Silas shook his head. "I was too late for your parents. But you saved me. I should have found you sooner. I was old enough to know better." Clara did not understand. Silas turned away. He had never told anyone what happened that night. The storm had begun while he was checking traps along the western ridge. He heard a horse screaming. He found the wagon overturned. Clara's mother was already dead. Her father had been thrown from the wagon and buried beneath the snow. The little girl was alive, but barely conscious. Silas carried her for nearly 6 hours. He followed the river. He built a fire whenever he could. He gave her the last of his food. And when he finally reached a trading route, he left her beside a sheltered woodpile with his compass in her hand. He had intended to return, but a second storm trapped him. By the time he came back, she was gone. Silas spent months trying to discover what happened. Eventually, he heard that the little girl had been taken east. He assumed she had survived. Then, life continued. He lost his brother. He lost his father. He lost nearly everyone he loved. Silas eventually convinced himself that the world was better without him. Clara listened to his story in silence. Then she said something he did not expect. "You were the first person who ever made me feel safe." Silas looked at her. "I don't remember my mother's face clearly anymore," Clara continued. "I don't remember what my father's voice sounded like. But I remember yours." Silas swallowed. Clara looked toward the cabin. "Why did you never marry?" Silas almost smiled. "Women ran." "You frightened them?" "I suppose." "Did you ever try to make them stay?" "No." "Why?" Silas stared at the snow. "Because if a woman wanted to leave, I wasn't going to stop her." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "I didn't come here to run." The words stayed between them. Over the next several days, Clara discovered that the stories about Silas were mostly wrong. He was not cruel. He was not dangerous. He was simply a man who had learned to survive without expecting anyone to stay. He woke before dawn. He chopped wood. He checked traps. He repaired fences. He collected water. He smoked meat. He spoke little. But when he did speak, Clara listened. She discovered that he had a dry sense of humor. She discovered that he could carve almost anything from wood. She discovered that he hated thunderstorms because they reminded him of the avalanche. And she discovered that he kept something hidden beneath the floorboards. A wooden box. Inside were dozens of small objects. A child's mitten, a broken brass button, a faded ribbon, a piece of blue cloth. And beneath them all was a letter. Clara did not open it. Silas did. It was a letter he had written 20 years earlier. It had never been sent. It was addressed simply, "To the little girl I could not save." Clara looked at him. "You thought I died." Silas nodded. "I looked for you." She touched the letter. "I looked for you too." For the first time, Silas's eyes filled with tears. Neither of them spoke. Then Clara reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Silas did not pull away. Their relationship did not change overnight. There was no sudden declaration, no magical transformation. Instead, it grew through small things. Clara learned how Silas liked his coffee. Silas repaired the broken buckle on Clara's traveling case. She helped him plant vegetables. He taught her how to read animal tracks. She taught him that silence could be peaceful instead of lonely. Weeks passed. Then spring began. Snow melted from the lower slopes. The creek opened. Birds returned. Clara could have gone back to the eastern towns. She could have returned to the life she had built before coming here. But she stayed. The people in the settlement began talking. Some said she had lost her mind. Others expected her to run, just like the women before her. Then one afternoon, a rider arrived from town with a message. Silas read it. His expression hardened. "What is it?" Clara asked. Silas folded the paper. "Nothing." She took it from his hand. It was from the settlement's richest landowner, Ezekiel Crane. Crane owned much of the valley. He wanted Silas's land. For years Silas had refused to sell. Now Crane had found another way. The message claimed that Silas had no legal claim to the property. If he did not leave within 30 days, Crane would take him to court. Clara looked at Silas. "Can he do that?" "Maybe." "Why didn't you tell me?" Silas stood. "Because you didn't come here to fight my battles." "No," Clara said. "I came here because you once fought for my life." Silas looked at her. "And I won't leave because someone wants your land." The next morning, they rode into town together. For the first time, the people of the settlement saw Clara beside Silas. The same man everyone believed was incapable of companionship. The same woman everyone expected to run. Nobody knew what would happen next, but Crane knew, and he was not pleased, because he had a secret of his own. 20 years earlier, on the night Clara disappeared, Crane's trading company had been moving supplies through the mountains. One of his men had found the wreckage of Clara's father's wagon, and that man had taken something from it, something that could prove who owned the land where Silas's cabin stood. A document, a deed that had been stolen before Silas ever built his home. Crane had kept it hidden for 20 years. Now Clara's return threatened to expose everything. The trouble began with a missing deed. Ezekiel Crane had spent years building his wealth through timber, cattle, and land speculation. He had bought properties from desperate families for almost nothing. He had pressured widows. He had cheated travelers. And when someone resisted, he used the courts. Silas Vale was one of the few men he could never intimidate. Silas owned a large stretch of mountain land. At least, he believed he did. The property had belonged to his father, but the original deed had disappeared decades earlier. Silas had never cared enough to investigate. He only wanted his cabin and the forest around it. Crane knew that. That was why he believed he could take the land. But Clara had changed the situation. She was educated. She knew how documents worked, and she had no fear of asking questions. She began searching through old records in the settlement. The county clerk showed her a registry containing land transfers from 20 years earlier. One entry caught her attention. A large section of northern mountain land had supposedly been sold to Crane's father in 1859, but the signature looked wrong. Clara compared it with another document bearing Silas's father's name. The signatures were different. Someone had forged the deed. Clara took the copies to Silas. He stared at them. "I knew my father never sold this land. Then someone stole it." Silas looked toward the mountains. Why would they wait 20 years? Because they thought no one would challenge them. Clara pointed to the date. "This deed was registered 3 months after your father's death." Silas said nothing. Then Clara noticed something else. The original witness listed on the deed was a man named Thomas Whitmore, her father. Clara's face went pale. "My father witnessed this?" Silas looked at her. "If the record is real, but it can't be. Why? My father could barely write his own name." Silas understood. The forged deed connected their pasts. Clara's father had been involved somehow, but not necessarily willingly. They began searching through old records. Eventually, they found an old newspaper article describing a supply wagon disaster during the winter of 1858. The article mentioned a young merchant named Thomas Whitmore. He had been transporting documents and money through the mountains. His wagon disappeared during a storm. Silas remembered that night. Clara remembered fragments, but neither knew the entire truth. They traveled deeper into the mountains. Silas led Clara to the place where he had found her as a child. The wreckage was long gone. Trees had grown over the trail, but Silas remembered a rock formation beside the creek. He knelt. There was a shallow depression in the ground. He began digging. Clara watched. After several minutes, his shovel struck metal. They uncovered a small iron box. Inside was a bundle of papers sealed in oilcloth. Clara opened them carefully. There was a ledger, a letter, and a second copy of the original land deed, but this one carried the correct signatures. The land had never been sold. Crane had forged the document. The ledger revealed something worse. Payments had been made to the man who served as witness, the same man who had later claimed that Silas's father had sold the property. Clara turned the pages. Then she found her father's name. Thomas Whitmore had been paid to transport the original deed, but he had never delivered it. Instead, he had hidden it. That was why he had been traveling through the mountains. He had discovered Crane's fraud. He was trying to expose it. The storm had killed him before he could. Clara sat beside the creek. Her entire childhood suddenly looked different. Her father had not simply been a careless traveler. He had been carrying evidence, and the men who wanted that evidence had followed him. Silas looked at her. "Your father was trying to protect my family." Clara shook her head. "He was trying to protect the land." Silas sat beside her. "Maybe both." Clara looked toward the ridge. "Did you know someone was following us that night?" Silas remembered. He had heard horses. He had seen lanterns through the snow. At the time he thought they were rescuers, but now he understood. Someone had been hunting for the documents, and when Silas found Clara, those men were still searching. He had unknowingly carried her away from them. That meant the man who saved Clara had also unknowingly protected the evidence that could destroy Crane. The past had finally connected itself, but Crane was not going to let them leave with the documents. As Silas and Clara returned to the cabin, they saw smoke rising from the valley. The settlement was burning. Crane had started a fire at an abandoned warehouse. He blamed Silas. By nightfall, the whole town was talking. Silas was accused of attacking Crane's property. Men began riding toward the mountain. Clara understood immediately. Crane did not want them arrested. He wanted the papers. Silas packed his rifle. Clara stopped him. "No." Silas looked at her. "You taught me something," she said. What? That running isn't always cowardice. She picked up the iron box. We don't fight them here. Silas understood. They needed to reach the county judge before Crane could destroy the evidence. The only route was through the northern pass. But the pass was dangerous. A storm was coming. They left before dawn. For 2 days they traveled through snow. Silas knew every ridge. Clara followed. At one point, her horse slipped. Silas caught her before she fell. They continued. Behind them, Crane's men followed their tracks. On the third night, they reached an abandoned mining station. Silas built a fire. Clara opened the ledger again. There was one final page, a list of names. Every man who had helped Crane steal land from mountain families. Several names belonged to respected men in the settlement. Clara realized the problem. If she brought this evidence to court, powerful people would lose everything. That meant Crane would do anything to stop her. Silas sat across the fire. You can still go. Clara looked at him. Go where? Anywhere. I spent 20 years finding you. Silas said nothing. I am not leaving now. The next morning, Crane found them. His men surrounded the mining station. Crane stepped inside. He offered Silas money. A large amount. Enough to leave the mountains forever. Silas refused. Crane offered Clara money too. She refused. Then Crane threatened them. You don't understand what you're carrying. Clara held up the ledger. I understand exactly what it is. Crane's face changed. He reached for his pistol. Silas moved first. The struggle lasted seconds. The gun fell. A shot exploded into the wooden ceiling. Silas knocked Crane to the ground. But one of Crane's men escaped. He carried word back to the settlement. By sunset, the sheriff arrived. The evidence was finally examined. The forged deed was exposed. The stolen land was returned. Crane was arrested. But there was one final mystery. The sheriff asked Clara why she had come to the mountains in the first place. She looked at Silas. To find the man who saved my life. The sheriff smiled. And did you find him? Clara took Silas's hand. Yes, but the story was not finished. Because after the court cleared Silas's land, Clara received a letter. It came from a woman living hundreds of miles away. The letter contained one sentence. I know where your mother is buried. Clara stared at the words. She had always believed her mother was buried beneath the snow where the wagon overturned. But the letter suggested otherwise. Someone had moved her body. Someone had known what happened that night, and the sender claimed to know why. Clara looked at Silas. The mountain man who had spent 20 years silent was no longer hiding from his past. Neither was she. They would have to travel again. But this time, they would go together. Summer came slowly to the mountains. Wildflowers appeared along the creek. The snow disappeared from the lower slopes. And for the first time in decades, Silas Vale's cabin no longer looked like the home of a man waiting for the end of his life. There were 2 cups beside the stove. 2 sets of boots near the door. 2 chairs on the porch. Clara had stayed, but she still carried questions. The letter about her mother remained folded inside her coat. It led them to a small cemetery near an old mission settlement far beyond the eastern ridge. They traveled for several days. When they arrived, Clara found a simple grave. Her mother's name was carved into a weathered wooden marker. Clara stood before it for a long time. She did not cry at first. She simply stared. Then she knelt. I thought you were lost, she whispered. Silas waited several steps behind her. Clara eventually discovered that her mother had survived the wagon accident for several hours. She had been badly injured. A traveling family had found her. She died before reaching the mission. The family had buried her there. The truth was painful, but it was not the truth Clara had feared. Her mother had not been abandoned. She had not disappeared without anyone caring. Someone had tried to save her. Clara finally understood that the night she lost her family had not been filled only with death. It had also been filled with people trying to help. Her father had hidden the deed. Her mother had protected her. Silas had carried her through the storm. A traveling family had buried her mother with dignity. And Clara had survived. The journey back to the mountains changed something between Clara and Silas. They no longer lived together because of an old rescue. They lived together because they had chosen one another. Still, Clara worried. She knew what people in town would say. Silas was the silent mountain man. She was the woman who refused to run. Some believed she had been foolish. Others believed she had married him out of gratitude. But Clara knew the truth. Gratitude had brought her to the mountain. Love was what made her stay. One evening, as they sat beside the creek, Clara asked Silas something she had never asked before. "Why did you stop speaking?" Silas watched the water. "After my brother died, I talked for days." Clara waited. "I talked to him." She looked at him. "He was dead," Silas said. "But I kept talking." His voice became quieter. Then one morning, I realized I couldn't remember what his voice sounded like. Silas looked toward the trees. So I stopped. Clara moved closer. "You don't have to stop remembering people to keep living." Silas looked at her. "I know that now." That was the closest thing to an explanation he had ever given. A few weeks later, Silas began rebuilding the old cabin. Not because it was falling apart, because he wanted to make room. He added another bedroom, a larger kitchen, a covered porch, and beside the cabin, he built a small workshop for Clara. She had always loved drawing. Now she began sketching the mountains. She drew the creek, the trees, the cabin, and eventually she drew Silas. He hated sitting still. She made him anyway. When she finished, she showed him the portrait. Silas stared at it. "I look old." "You are old." He raised an eyebrow. Clara laughed. For the first time, she heard him laugh too. It was quiet, almost unfamiliar, but real. Autumn arrived. The settlement changed its opinion of Silas. Not completely. People rarely abandon old stories quickly. But the truth about Crane had spread. The land records were repaired. Several families recovered property they had lost. Silas became known not as the monster in the mountain, but as the man who had refused to surrender his home. Then something unexpected happened. A family arrived at Silas's cabin to marry a man in town. The father asked Silas for advice. Silas stared at him. "What do you want me to say?" The man looked uncomfortable. "You've been married before." Silas glanced toward Clara. "No." The father smiled. "You know what I mean." Clara laughed from the doorway. Silas shook his head. "I've only learned one thing." "What?" "Don't marry someone because you're afraid of being alone." The man nodded. "And if you find someone you want beside you?" Silas looked at Clara. "Don't make her prove she'll stay." Clara smiled. Those words became the story people remembered. Not the forged deed, not Crane, not the storm. The story of the woman who walked into the mountains looking for a man everyone else feared. And the man who finally learned that silence did not have to mean loneliness. Years later, people still told the story. They said every bride who had ever gone to Silas Vale had run away. But Clara always corrected them. She didn't run because she wasn't his bride. Then she would smile. She was the woman who came looking for him. The mountain remained remote. Winter still came hard. The trails still disappeared beneath snow. The creek still froze. But Silas no longer faced winter alone. Every evening, Clara lit the lantern by the window. Silas would come inside carrying wood. She would pour 2 cups of coffee. Sometimes they spoke for hours. Sometimes they said almost nothing. They did not need to. There was comfort in the silence now. One winter night, nearly 25 years after the storm that changed their lives, Clara woke to the sound of wind against the cabin. She walked to the window. Snow covered the forest. For a moment she remembered being 6 years old. She remembered the cold, the fear, the darkness. Then she remembered strong arms carrying her through the trees. She turned. Silas was standing behind her. "You remember?" he asked. "Every winter," she replied. He looked toward the snow. "I used to hate this season. Do you still?" Silas shook his head. "Not anymore." Clara reached for his hand. Outside, the mountain was silent. But this time, the silence did not feel empty. It felt like home. And perhaps that was the real story. Clara had spent 20 years searching for the man who saved her life. She believed she was looking for someone from her past. But when she found him, she discovered something neither of them expected. Sometimes the person who saves you does not remain in your life. Sometimes they disappear into the mountains. Sometimes years pass. Sometimes memories fade. And sometimes, against all odds, two people find their way back to one another. Silas had once believed that everyone eventually leaves. Clara had spent her childhood believing that everyone she loved could disappear. Together they learned something different. Some people leave. Some people are lost. Some people are taken by storms, accidents, or time. But sometimes one person stays, and sometimes, after spending half your life searching for the person who once saved you, you discover that you were not meant to repay them. You were meant to remind them that their life was worth saving too. That was why Clara had climbed the mountain. Not because she needed a husband, not because she was desperate, not because she believed the stories about the silent mountain man. She came because she remembered a frightened little girl being carried through a blizzard by a young man who refused to leave her behind. She came because 20 years earlier, when the whole world had disappeared beneath the snow, Silas Vale had chosen to keep walking. And years later, when Silas had forgotten how to hope, Clara chose to walk toward him. The man everyone feared found the woman who remembered his kindness. The woman everyone expected to run found a reason to stay. And the silent mountain man finally understood that some promises do not need words. They only need someone willing to keep them. If you stayed until the end of this story, thank you for listening. If this story touched you, leave a like and subscribe for more emotional mountain romances, forgotten legends, and stories of people who find love in the most unexpected places. Because sometimes the greatest love story is not about finding someone new. It is about finding the person who was there when you needed them most, and realizing that, after all those years, they were still waiting for you.